The eternal struggle of the hobbyist. You got a battalion of miniatures staring at you, all grey and unpainted, and game day is just around the corner. You're desperate to avoid the shame of feeling the dreaded Grey Legion, but also want to leave some room to show off your artistic flair later when you have time to come back and make them prettier. It's a tightrope walk between speed painting and making sure you don't end up with a mess that even Nervo would turn his nose up at. Gunking up details or creating some texture that can't be fixed without stripping, while rushing to finish your army men. In this video I painted the new Skaventide Stormcast the way I would if I had to rush them out in a weekend, and then gradually invested more time to make them look better. All the while trying to find the golden or maybe silver sweet spot where you invested just the right amount of time for them to shine on the battlefield without losing your sanity. Because some techniques are super effective, quick to do with a high impact, and some look very cool close up but do almost nothing for the army on the table. So knowing when it makes sense to go the extra mile and when to stop is actually a skill in itself that needs to be honed. After all these years of painting, I've had a revelation of sort. As much as I like to take artistic approaches for my showcase pieces, just me, my brush and acrylic paint, maybe use the airbrush now and then and make the most out of it without the constraints of thinking in techniques. When it comes to armies though, in that context I like techniques that have a more crisp execution. One example of that is using oil washes for recess shading, like I did here on this white scar or this Imperial Fist Terminator. Nothing beats the speed, the impact, and you can even mess up without having to start over because you can just wipe it away as long as it's not cured. And even then, it's not really a problem. There's still a few pitfalls to avoid, but we'll get to that in a minute. Oil washes work surprisingly well on every type of mini. I guess I prefer contrast paints for organic shapes, but especially on minis that have a lot of armor, I don't think I would want to use anything else. And since Stormcast are basically Space Marines and I have a lot of experience painting these, I knew it would also work on these scouts. After assembling my test subject, I built a simple desert base using some terraform texture by Ammo and a few printed bits. This texture dry brushes up nicely if you want a quick solution, but the same texture also allows for more sophisticated results, using washes and other techniques if you want to put more time in. Then I went ahead and primed the Stormcast with a metal spray. I tried the new Color Forged Silver Spray Primer because nothing says I'm in a rush more than skipping half the painting steps. Of course, there is tons of options for spray can primers out there nowadays. You could also just use lead belcher if you don't have access to anything else. The exact tone doesn't really matter, just pick something that isn't too dark or too bright. I placed the link to everything I used in this video in the description. It's leading you to Element Games. They just have everything, even the obscurest things I use. I will just look it up on their site and it's there. And it's meant to show a comprehensive list of all the products I used, but of course it's also an affiliate link. So if you buy anything from the site, it gives me a bit of kickback and supports the channel. Starting from a metallic base coat speeds things up tremendously. The next step is just as fast while also having a great impact, simply because it creates contrast and depth so quickly. And because I'm going to use the same shadow color on all parts to speed things up even more, at this point I'm also applying the other base colors that are not metal, like the shoulder guard, the scrolls that definitely are not purity seals, the leather parts, handles of the weapons, and the plume. Then I gave the mini a coat of gloss varnish, which creates a smooth surface, and that's important for the oil wash to work in the intended way, running off of most of the surfaces and to collect in the recesses. I really like using Starship Filth from Abteilung for most of my models. It's dark and gritty, but not so black that it looks like you dropped your mini into a pot of ink. Of course, you can also use black or even mix in a bit of blue to achieve some richer shadows, but that's totally up to you. I'm using this odorless thinner because anything else gives me a headache even with a face mask. And I just add a few brush tips of Starship Filth until the coverage is good. Just make sure the paint is dissolved properly when creating the oil wash. You really don't want any undissolved blobs of oil paint on your mini. Then I'm taking a not so great brush and start slapping the wash everywhere. And you can see how the gloss varnish leads to the paint running off of most areas and collecting in the recesses, which is exactly what we desire. You can be really messy here. There's not much you can do wrong because even if we have some buildup on areas that don't need shading, there will be a cleanup step after this that fixes everything. I typically let this cure overnight because in the mortal realms, some things just take time. Unfortunately, there's not much you can do to make this faster since it's a chemical curing process. One thing you can do before mixing the wash to speed the curing up is place the oil paint on a piece of cardboard and have the oil leach out from the paint, and then add the thinner. Some painters like cotton swabs for the cleanup step, but I prefer these makeup brushes. I have these specialized swabs for super detailed work, but even these leave some fiber here and there, and it's just a hassle to me. The makeup sponges are a lot cleaner, but there's a downside. You need to be careful not to press down too hard or it will get into the recesses and destroy your shading. So get the tiniest makeup sponges you can or cut them down and glue them to a toothpick for more precision. If the oil paint is cured already, you might have to add a tiny amount of thinner to the sponge so you can wipe off the oil paint again. After the paint was fully cured, I hit the whole mini with a matte varnish to lock in that glorious gritty look and to protect it while adding the next layers of paint. And after that, it was time for the first evaluation. You can see how effective this technique is. Very deep shadows, and it doesn't even matter too much that it's the same shade on every color. Imagine hitting that with a bright dry brush color to pronounce the edges and you'd have a miniature ready to smite chaos in under 20 minutes. But at the same time, it's a great starting point that you can easily improve on once you have more time to put in. I'm not gonna lie though, I still need to dial in a few things. You can see that my primer was a bit grainy. The oil paint loves to settle in those tiny crevices and it gave me this lovely white noise effect. The plume looks a lot cleaner simply because we applied an additional layer of paint and that did smooth out the surface. So one thing that could fix this is to add a second or even a third layer of gloss varnish to even out the surfaces. Now let's take this great start and make it look even better. But before we do that, a word from this video's sponsor, Firelock Games and their brand new game Port Royal. Port Royal has been described as more time set in the Caribbean, only better. A dynamic campaign-based, narrative-driven skirmish game set after the historic 1692 earthquake that devastated the island of Jamaica. Play as one of 7 factions, each with their own set of rules and abilities that will aid you in your quest to seek treasure and fortune in the ruins of the city. Pick a captain and build a crew around them, and off you go into the city of Port Royal. The game has an intriguing campaign mode where the outcome of one game affects any further encounters down the line. Characters killed are removed from your roster, injuries sustained influence them and alter their abilities and usefulness in future games. Experience gained will make them more proficient in plundering and disposing of your opponents. And any treasure grabbed will buy you new crew members and better equipment. Port Royal has an active and reactive gameplay where any of your actions can trigger a reaction by your opponent. This keeps games fast-paced and fun, and you always have to stay on your toes if you want to claim your share of the plunder that Port Royal has to offer. Firelock Games is making historical games fun and accessible to a wide audience, and they just finished another successful Kickstarter campaign with Port Royal. They unlocked all of their fantastic stretch goals, and you can still grab this gem of a game through their backer kit. Just follow the link in the description. One of my favorite techniques is using existing layers of metallics and staining them with inks or contrast paint to make them look like gold or other metals. I did that a lot in the past on some of my Space Marine recipes, and I knew it would be the perfect fit for this miniature too. After all, if you're not making them look like the golden boys of Azir, are you even trying? I mixed Imperial Fist contrast paint with a few brush tips of burnt umber ink to desaturate the yellow, and then applied one layer of the mix to all areas that I wanted gold. Wherever the color hit the pre-shade, it turned into this interesting greenish color. That was a great bonus. I really like the almost illustration-like result this gives. Maybe it's the additive way to paint, maybe it's how the different paints are blocked in on the individual elements. But it's interesting to see how these techniques give a certain predetermined style. And it's also interesting that from this point on, you can take it into a lot of different directions. I highlighted up the green parts focusing on the higher areas and every rounded part where the light usually collects. Then I mixed the brighter blue and defined the blue shoulder guard with an edge highlight and a volumetric highlight on the spherical part. Small details like the gems are a great opportunity to add some cool detail without a lot of effort. They are geometrical objects with defined planes and sharp edges, and I just painted the area facing up in a very bright green and added a dot of white, and then darkened the lower areas. This only took a few minutes and look how effective it is. I added edge highlights and basic volumetric highlights to all other elements like the leather and the handles. Then I set out to put highlights on the metallics. If you saw my video about the army paint and metallics, you can already guess what's coming. For the gold, I used my newly found universal highlight color tinted gold. It's so great because it fits all kinds of different metals, whether that's gold, bronze, copper, or anything in between. It almost feels like it is adapting to the base color it's applied on, which makes it a really nice tool to have. If you want to learn more about that, I'll link the video in the description, but here I used it to make the gold stand out more. Of course, I'm focusing on the edges, but on more complicated shapes like the lion head, it makes sense to define a few parts in a non-metallic metal way. For example, the larger highlight on the back of the nose and the volumetric definition on the spherical parts of the mouth, with the main highlights facing up. Finally, I'm also putting edge highlights on the steel armor and the hammers to frame and define the shapes a bit more. And here and there I gave the surfaces some texture, especially on the hammer, because obviously he's using them to hit things with. After this step, all the contrasts are cranked up to 11, the green has a lot more depth, and the shapes are defined and look a lot more dynamic. The metals are more believable too, going from very dark, almost black shadows to very bright, almost white highlights. Ultimately, this is what we need to do in miniature painting, whether it's for the table or the showcase. It's selling us the illusion that this is the representation of a living and breathing killing machine. After all, there's a reason why Games Workshop color schemes focus so heavily on edge highlights. The bright highlights increase the contrast on the gold, but also desaturate it a bit. That's always the trade-off between making it look good on the table and how gold is actually looking on average, usually having a more orange hue. In general, the Mini right now looks very monochrome, which in reality is rarely the case, so that's where I'm mostly going to spend the rest of the time. First, I was preparing a hue that I could shade the steel armor with. I was using Athematic blue, which is a turquoise, and Thalasar blue, which is a primary blue. There's no right or wrong here, you could even use other colors like a straight up dark green or brown tones. I mainly do this to add some variety and to make the gray armor look a bit more interesting. And you can see that the added color does exactly that. But I'm also directing the pigments to settle in areas that I want shaded. Anything that curves down receives 2 or 3 layers, which makes it darker, and so on. At this point, I'm also adding more variety to other very monotonous areas like the chainmail armor around his hips. Here I was using Nastrag yellow to stain every second row of gold and added some thin layers of burnt sienna to spice the gold scales up even more, adding some variety. And last but not least, all the scales received a bright edge highlight, which looked great against the very dark recess wash. I thought about leaving the hammers more like the original gray, but then decided to also add more color variety. First glazing them with some burnt umber, which looks extremely good over the very dark parts especially, like on the handle. And then added a thin layer of my armor mix. That distinguished the two different metals enough, while still looking like they are part of the same Mini. The blue wash dulled down the metal a bit, so I used white aluminium to bring back some of the shine, and less blue highlights will also keep the armor looking like steel rather than something conjured up by an over-enthusiastic Realm Shaper engine. Then it was time to revisit the gold. Remember, I said that the hue of the gold was a little too cold for my taste, so I used thinned down burnt sienna, which is a red-brown, but it adds this slightly orange glow when glazed over the Imperial Fist yellow. After I painted the base with a mix of brown and barbarian skin, I gave it a highlight by mixing in ivory and then added some thinned down washes of Nastrag yellow for some more depth and reapplied a final highlight. It's always a good idea to integrate your minis with the base, so I used a thinned down wash of my highlight color to simulate some dust collecting in the recesses of the armor on the feet. For everything we did after the 1 hour mark, it gets harder and harder to see the difference on first glance. More interesting shadows and color variations in gold maybe lend themselves more for character models or centerpieces. The gold looks a lot more natural and credible after painstakingly glazing in thin layers of burnt sienna, and I love the result, but will anyone notice from a few feet away on the tabletop? But if you're gunning for that best painted army trophy, these details might just tip the scales in your favor. So ultimately, you have to figure out what your goal is and how far you want to take it. I hope showing you this system of painting that's starting very simple with the most impactful techniques and gradually adding more and more elements gave you a few ideas for your own painting. If you like the idea, but Stormcast aren't your thing, you can see it applied to more organic shapes in this video, or maybe you are more interested in a video that teaches the basics of brushwork, then I recommend clicking on this one. Thanks for watching, keep pushing that pigment, and see you next time.